The crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Williamsburg, Texas, as Penelope Summers ducked behind a water trough, clutching her medical bag to her chest. It wasn't the first time the town doctor had found herself caught in the crossfire of drunken cowboys, and at 27 years old, she doubted it would be the last. The year was 1876, and the West was still wild enough to test the mettle of even the strongest souls. Penelope waited for the commotion to die down before rising from her hiding spot, brushing the dirt from her plain brown skirt. A woman doctor was rare enough to invite scorn, but a barren woman doctor was practically a pariah in these parts. The whispers followed her everywhere, how God had cursed her womb for daring to step into a man's profession, how no man would ever want a wife who couldn't bear children, how she was as worthless as a dry well in August. "You all right there, Doc?" Sheriff Mills called out, tipping his hat as he dragged a bloodied cowboy toward the jailhouse. "Nothing damaged but my dignity," Penelope replied, straightening her spine and lifting her chin. "Another Saturday night in paradise." The sheriff chuckled, but his eyes held a touch of pity that made Penelope's stomach turn. She'd seen that look too many times since her condition became common knowledge, since her husband Thomas had announced to the entire saloon that his wife was as barren as the salt flats, before riding out of town with a saloon girl half his age. Penelope continued down the street toward her small clinic, which also served as her home since Thomas had left. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dirt road, and the smell of cooking fires filled the air as families prepared their evening meals. Families, something she would never have. As she approached her clinic, she noticed a large black stallion tethered outside, stomping impatiently. Beside it stood a smaller pony with two young girls sitting atop it, their faces dirty and tear-streaked. The older couldn't have been more than 7, the younger perhaps 4. A tall man paced in front of her door, his face obscured by the brim of a dusty black hat. When he heard her approach, he turned, revealing a weathered face with piercing blue eyes and several days' worth of stubble on his strong jaw. "Are you the doctor?" he asked, his voice deep and strained. "I am," Penelope replied, fishing her key from her pocket. "Dr. Penelope Summers." "Blake Jenkins," he said with a curt nod. "My nieces need help." Penelope unlocked the door and stepped inside, lighting a lamp as Blake ushered the two exhausted girls into the clinic. In the warm glow, she could see that both children were pale and thin, with dark circles under their eyes. "This here's Mary," Blake said, placing a protective hand on the older girl's shoulder. "And the little one's Elizabeth. Their mom, my sister, passed 3 days ago. Consumption. Their pa was killed in a mining accident last winter." "I'm very sorry for your loss," Penelope said softly, setting her medical bag down. "How can I help?" "They haven't eaten proper in days. Been crying so much they're making themselves sick, and the little one's got a cough that don't sound right." Blake removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair streaked with dust from the trail. "I don't know the first thing about caring for little girls, madam. I've been a ranch hand all my life." Penelope knelt in front of the children, her heart aching at their frightened expressions. "Hello, Mary. Hello, Elizabeth. I'm Dr. Penelope, but you can call me Penny if you like. Would you like something to eat while I take a look at that cough?" Mary nodded, her thin shoulders squared with a child's attempt at bravery. "Yes, madam. Lizzie ain't eaten since yesterday noon." "I'm not hungry," the younger girl whispered, contradicted by the loud rumble of her stomach. Penelope smiled gently. "I have some chicken broth and bread. Would that do?" While Blake settled the girls at her small kitchen table, Penelope heated the broth from her own dinner and sliced the bread she'd baked that morning. She watched as Blake awkwardly tried to comfort Elizabeth when she started coughing, his large hands hovering uncertainly over her tiny shoulders. "Where are you heading?" Penelope asked as she placed bowls in front of the hungry children. "My sister's letter said I was all they had left," Blake answered, standing back to give the girls room to eat. "I've got a small spread about 30 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. Thought I'd take them there, but He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. But you don't know how to raise two little girls, Penelope finished for him. Blake nodded, his expression grim. I ain't never even been around children much. Wouldn't know what to feed them or how to, the girl things. After the girls had eaten, Penelope examined Elizabeth, listening to her lungs and checking her temperature. It's not consumption, she assured Blake, seeing the fear in his eyes. Just a chest cold. With proper care and rest, she'll recover quickly. Relief washed over his face. That's good news, at least. The girls were fighting to keep their eyes open, exhaustion evident in their drooping shoulders. Penelope led them to her own bedroom, helping them wash their faces and hands before tucking them into her bed. They fell asleep almost instantly. When she returned to the main room, Blake was standing by the window, staring out at the darkening street. They can stay here tonight, Penelope said. There's room at the hotel for you. Blake turned, his expression troubled. Doc, I need to ask you something, and I know it's forward, but I'm desperate. Penelope raised an eyebrow, waiting. Would you consider coming with us, just for a week or two, to help get them settled? He rushed on before she could respond. I can pay you well. I've saved most of what I've earned over the years, but those girls need a woman's care, and I don't know what I'm doing. Penelope stared at him, taken aback. Mr. Jenkins, I have patients here. I can't just leave. Isn't there another doctor in the next town over? Couldn't he cover for you? Blake asked, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. Please, I wouldn't ask if I wasn't at my wit's end. Penelope hesitated. It was true that Dr. Wilson from Fairfield often covered for her when she needed to travel to deliver babies or treat patients too ill to come to town. And the idea of spending a few weeks away from the whispers and pitying looks was tempting. I'll think about it, she finally said. Let me check on the girls one more time and then we can discuss it further. In the bedroom, Penelope stood watching the two small forms huddled together beneath her quilt. Elizabeth coughed in her sleep, and Mary instinctively pulled her sister closer. These children had lost everything: mother, father, home. All they had left was an uncle who clearly cared for them, but had no idea how to raise them. When she returned to the main room, Blake was pacing again. I'll go, Penelope said suddenly, surprising even herself. But only for 2 weeks, just to help them settle in and to make sure Elizabeth's cough clears up completely. The relief on Blake's face was palpable. Thank you, Doc. I can't tell you what this means. I'll need a day to make arrangements with Dr. Wilson and pack some supplies, Penelope said, already mentally listing what she would need to bring. We can leave the day after tomorrow. Blake nodded. That's fair. I'll get a room at the hotel and let the girls rest here tonight if that's all right. After Blake left, Penelope sat at her kitchen table, wondering what she had just agreed to. 2 weeks at a remote ranch with a man she'd just met, and 2 orphaned girls. It was madness. And yet, looking at those children, she hadn't been able to refuse. The next day passed in a flurry of activity. Dr. Wilson agreed to cover her patients, though not without a knowing smirk that made Penelope want to slap him. She packed medical supplies, clothing, and as many books as she could fit in her trunk. Blake purchased a small wagon for the journey, as the girls were too young to ride horseback for such a distance. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cool. Blake loaded Penelope's trunk onto the wagon while she made one final check of her clinic. We're ready when you are, Doc, Blake called from outside. The girls were already seated in the wagon, wrapped in warm blankets against the morning chill. Mary watched Penelope with solemn eyes that seemed far too old for her young face, while Elizabeth clutched a rag doll that Penelope had given her the day before. Miss Penny, are you really coming to live with us? Elizabeth asked, her voice small. Just for a little while, Penelope explained, climbing up beside them. Until you're all settled in your new home. Uncle Blake says you're going to teach him how to take care of us proper, Mary said, her tone serious. He says he don't know nothing about little girls. Penelope smiled, adjusting the blanket around Elizabeth's shoulders. Well, I don't know much about ranches, so perhaps we can all learn from each other. Blake mounted his stallion, tying the reins of the pony to the back of the wagon. We should reach the ranch by nightfall if we make good time, he said, guiding his horse to the front of the wagon. As they left Williamsburg behind, Penelope felt a curious mixture of anxiety and relief. For the first time in years, no one was whispering behind her back or giving her those pitying looks. For 2 weeks, she could just be Penelope, not that barren doctor woman. The journey was slow, with frequent stops to rest the horses and let the girls stretch their legs. Penelope was impressed by Blake's patience with the children, despite his obvious discomfort. He answered Mary's endless questions about the ranch and the cattle, and he even attempted to play a clumsy game of chase with Elizabeth during one of their rest stops. As the sun began to set, Blake pointed ahead to a small valley nestled between rolling hills. That's it, Jenkins Ranch. It was modest compared to some of the spreads Penelope had seen, but there was a certain charm to the place. A small but sturdy 2-story house stood at the center, with a barn and several outbuildings nearby. A creek wound through the property, and in the distance, Penelope could see cattle grazing on the hillsides. "It ain't much," Blake said, almost apologetically. "But the house is sound and there's good water year-round." "It's beautiful," Penelope said honestly. As they approached the house, a man emerged from the barn, waving. "That's Hank," Blake explained. "He helps me with the cattle, only other person on the property most times." Hank, a weathered man in his 50s with a friendly smile, greeted them as they pulled up to the house. "Got everything ready like you asked, boss. Cleaned out the extra rooms and stocked the pantry." "Much obliged, Hank," Blake replied, lifting Elizabeth from the wagon. "This here's Dr. Summers. She's going to be staying with us for a couple weeks to help with the girls." Hank tipped his hat to Penelope. "Madam, mighty glad to have you. The boss has been worried sick about bringing these little ones home." The house was simple but clean, with a large kitchen and sitting room downstairs and 3 bedrooms upstairs. "My room's at the end of the hall," Blake said as he showed them around. "Thought the girls could take the room next to mine and you can have the one across the hall." "That will be fine," Penelope said, noting the fresh linens on the beds and the vases of wildflowers that had been placed in each room, clearly Hank's doing. After a simple dinner of beans, bacon, and cornbread, Blake helped Penelope settle the exhausted girls into their new bedroom. The room had been hastily converted from what appeared to be a storage space, with a large bed that would easily fit both children and a small chest of drawers. "I'll build them proper beds soon," Blake promised as he watched Penelope tuck the girls in. "And get them whatever else they need." "Uncle Blake," Mary called as he turned to leave, "will you tell us a story? Mama always told us a story before bed." Blake froze, his expression panicked. "I don't know any stories fit for little girls." "I know some," Penelope offered, seeing his distress. "Would you like to hear about Cinderella?" As Penelope told the familiar tale, she was aware of Blake leaning against the doorframe, listening as intently as the children. When both girls had finally drifted off to sleep, they quietly left the room. "Thank you," Blake said as they descended the stairs. "I wouldn't have known what to do." "Children need routines," Penelope explained, "especially after experiencing such loss. Bedtime stories, regular meals, consistent rules. These things help them feel secure." They sat at the kitchen table, a lamp burning low between them. Blake poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one toward Penelope. "Tell me about them," Penelope said. "Your sister and her husband." Blake's expression softened. "Sarah was my little sister, 5 years younger, stubborn as a mule and twice as smart. Married Joseph Miller when she was 18. He was a good man, worked hard in the mines. They were happy, far as I could tell from her letters." He sighed, turning his cup slowly. "I should have visited more. Been there for her when Joseph died. But the ranch—" "You're here for her children now," Penelope said gently. "That's what matters." Blake nodded, his blue eyes meeting hers across the table. "I appreciate you coming, Doc, more than I can say." "Penelope," she corrected, "if we're going to be living under the same roof for 2 weeks, you might as well use my name." "Penelope," he repeated, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "And I'm Blake." The next morning, Penelope woke to the sounds of a household already stirring. She dressed quickly and headed downstairs to find Blake attempting to cook breakfast while simultaneously trying to braid Elizabeth's hair. The results were disastrous on both fronts. The bacon was burning, and Elizabeth's hair looked like it had been arranged by a blind man in a windstorm. "Let me," Penelope said, taking the hairbrush from Blake's hand. She rescued the bacon, then sat Elizabeth on a stool to properly braid her hair. "I told Uncle Blake you'd know how," Elizabeth said, beaming up at Penelope. "He kept pulling too hard." "It's tricky if you've never done it before," Penelope said diplomatically, casting a sympathetic glance at Blake, who was now struggling with frying eggs. Mary appeared, already dressed but with her own hair in tangles. "Can you do mine too, Miss Penny? I can never get the back right." By the time breakfast was ready, both girls had neat braids, and Blake had managed to produce edible, if somewhat crispy, eggs and bacon. They ate together at the kitchen table, the girls chattering about exploring their new home. "Can we see the horses, Uncle Blake?" Mary asked eagerly. "After breakfast," Blake promised, "but you stay with me or Hank, understand? No wandering off alone." The day fell into a natural rhythm. While Blake showed the girls around the ranch, Penelope unpacked her medical supplies and set up a small area in her room for examining Elizabeth and treating any minor injuries that might occur. She also took inventory of the kitchen supplies, making a list of items they would need from town. At lunchtime, Blake brought the girls back to the house, their faces flushed with excitement from their tour of the property. Elizabeth's cough seemed better in the fresh air, though Penelope made a note to prepare a honey and herb mixture for her to take before bed. "Miss Penny, Uncle Blake says there's wild strawberries by the creek," Elizabeth announced as they sat down to a simple lunch of sandwiches. "Can we go pick some later?" "If your uncle says it's all right," Penelope replied, glancing at Blake. He nodded. "There's a good patch not far from the house, safe enough if you're with them." After lunch, Penelope took the girls to pick strawberries while Blake went to check on the cattle with Hank. It was a peaceful afternoon, the warm sun dappling through the trees that lined the creek, the girls' laughter a welcome sound after their earlier grief. "Miss Penny," Mary said as they walked back to the house with their baskets of berries, "why don't you have any children of your own?" The innocent question felt like a knife to Penelope's heart, but she kept her voice steady. "God didn't see fit to bless me with children." "But you'd be a good mama," Elizabeth said, slipping her small hand into Penelope's. "You know how to do hair and tell stories." "Thank you, sweetheart," Penelope said, squeezing the little girl's hand. "That's very kind of you to say." When they returned to the house, Penelope taught the girls how to make a simple strawberry pie, letting them help with rolling the dough and arranging the berries. The kitchen was a mess by the time they finished, with flour dusting every surface and sticky red fingerprints on the table. But the pie looked delicious, cooling on the windowsill. Blake returned just before dinner, his face lighting up at the sight of the pie. "Well now, that's a fine-looking dessert," he said, ruffling Elizabeth's hair. "Did you help make that?" "Miss Penny taught us how," Elizabeth exclaimed proudly. "I put in the most strawberries." "Did you now?" Blake grinned, lifting her up to see the pie more closely. "Looks like you did a mighty fine job." Over dinner, Blake told stories about the ranch and the cattle, carefully edited for the girls' ears, but still exciting enough to keep them enthralled. Penelope watched him with the children, noting how his initial awkwardness was already beginning to fade. There was a natural kindness to the man that the girls responded to, despite his lack of experience with children. After dinner, as Blake was helping Mary wash the dishes, his large hands comically gentle with the plates, Penelope prepared Elizabeth's medicine. The little girl made a face at the taste, but swallowed it obediently. "Will it make my cough go away?" she asked hopefully. "It should help," Penelope assured her, "and so will plenty of rest. Let's get you both ready for bed, shall we?" This time, when Mary asked for a story, Blake hesitantly offered to tell one. "It's not fancy like Cinderella," he warned, "but my pa used to tell it to me and your mama when we were small." The tale he told was a simple one about a coyote who tried to steal the moon, but the girls listened with rapt attention. Penelope, sitting in a chair by the window, found herself equally captivated, not by the story itself, but by the way Blake's deep voice gentled as he spoke to the children, by the tenderness in his eyes as he looked at his nieces. When the story was finished and the girls were tucked in, Blake and Penelope retreated downstairs once more. "You're good with them," Penelope observed as they sat in the sitting room, the lamp casting warm shadows across the walls. Blake shook his head. "I'm fumbling in the dark. But they're good kids. Make it easier than it could be." "Children are resilient," Penelope agreed, "but they still need stability, security." "That's what I aim to give them," Blake said firmly. "Whatever it takes." They sat in companionable silence for a while. The only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the occasional pop from the small fire Blake had built to ward off the evening chill. "Can I ask you something personal?" Blake finally said, his voice low. Penelope tensed, knowing what was coming. "You want to know why I don't have children of my own?" Blake nodded, his expression curious but not unkind. "You're good with them? Natural-like? Seems a shame." Penelope took a deep breath. "I was married once, for 3 years. We tried to have children, but..." She shrugged, the old pain washing over her. "My husband decided he wanted a wife who could give him sons. He left me for a younger woman. Made sure everyone in town knew why." Blake's jaw tightened. "Man sounds like a fool." "The irony is that I became a doctor because I wanted to help women in childbirth," Penelope continued, staring into the fire. "My mother died bringing my younger brother into the world. I thought I could make a difference." She gave a bitter laugh. "Now the women of Williamsburg barely trust me to deliver their babies. What would a barren woman know about childbirth after all?" "That's not right," Blake said quietly. "From what I've seen, you'd make a fine mother. And clearly you're a good doctor, or I wouldn't have trusted you with the girls." His simple statement of faith warmed something in Penelope that had been cold for a very long time. "Thank you," she said softly. The days began to fall into a routine. Mornings were spent teaching Blake the basics of caring for the girls, how to properly braid hair, what foods were suitable for children, the importance of regular bathing and clean clothing. Afternoons often found Penelope teaching the girls their letters and numbers, as their schooling had been irregular at best. Blake, for his part, made time each day to be with the children despite the demands of the ranch. He took them riding on gentle ponies, taught them the names of the wildflowers that grew on the property, and patiently answered Mary's endless questions about cattle and horses. A week into her stay, Penelope was sitting on the porch, mending one of Elizabeth's dresses, when Blake approached from the barn. He'd been working all morning, and his shirt was damp with sweat, his face streaked with dirt. "The girls are napping," Penelope informed him as he sat down on the step below her, removing his hat to wipe his brow. "Good. They need the rest." He turned to look up at her, squinting against the sunlight. "Elizabeth's cough is better." "Yes, she's responding well to the treatment." Penelope set aside her sewing. "Blake, we need to talk about what will happen when I leave next week." His expression darkened. "I know. Been thinking about it too." "The girls need schooling," Penelope said, "and proper clothes. They can't keep wearing the same 2 dresses. And there's the matter of feminine issues that will arise as Mary gets older." Blake ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing on end. "I know all that. Been trying to figure it out. Thought maybe I could hire a woman from town to come up a few days a week, help with the house and the girls." "That's a possibility," Penelope agreed, though her heart twisted strangely at the thought of another woman taking her place in this household. "But they need consistency, Blake. A motherly figure they can count on, not just someone who comes and goes." "You saying I should get married?" Blake asked, a wry smile twisting his lips. "Ain't exactly a line of eligible ladies waiting to become an instant mother to 2 orphaned girls on a modest ranch 30 miles from town." Penelope returned to her sewing, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm just saying you need to consider all options for the girls' well-being." That evening, after the girls were in bed, a thunderstorm rolled across the valley. The wind howled around the house, and rain lashed against the windows. Penelope was reading by lamplight in the sitting room when a particularly loud thunderclap shook the house, followed immediately by the sound of small feet pattering down the stairs. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her face tear-streaked, clutching her rag doll. "Miss Penny, I'm scared," she whimpered. Penelope set aside her book and opened her arms. "Come here, sweetheart. It's just a storm. It can't hurt you inside the house." Elizabeth climbed onto her lap, burying her face against Penelope's shoulder. "Mama used to sing to me during storms," she said, her voice small. "Would you like me to sing to you?" Penelope offered, smoothing the child's tangled hair. Elizabeth nodded, and Penelope began to sing a lullaby her own mother had sung to her, rocking gently as the storm raged outside. She was so focused on comforting the child that she didn't hear Blake enter the room until he spoke. "Mary's hiding under her blankets," he said softly. "Thought I'd bring her down too." He carried Mary, wrapped in a quilt, to the settee across from Penelope. The older girl was trying hard not to cry, but her lower lip trembled with each thunder roll. "Miss Penny's singing," Elizabeth informed her sister. "It makes the scary go away." "Would you like to hear the song too, Mary?" Penelope asked gently. Mary nodded, her eyes wide as another flash of lightning illuminated the room. Blake settled beside her on the settee, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Penelope continued her song, her voice soft but steady against the storm's fury. Gradually, the girls' fear subsided, their eyelids growing heavy despite the noise outside. "I think they're falling asleep," Blake whispered as Penelope finished her song. Elizabeth was indeed asleep in Penelope's arms, her breathing deep and even. Mary was fighting to keep her eyes open, her head nodding against Blake's shoulder. "Should we take them back upstairs?" Penelope asked. Blake shook his head. "Let's let them sleep down here tonight. I'll build up the fire to keep them warm." While Blake tended to the fire, Penelope arranged pillows and blankets on the settee for the girls. They barely stirred as they were transferred from laps to makeshift beds. "You're good with them," Blake said as they stood watching the sleeping children. "Natural-like." "So are you," Penelope replied. "You're learning quickly." Blake turned to look at her, his expression serious in the firelight. "Penelope, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about the girls needing consistency." "A mother figure," Penelope's heart quickened. "Yes? Would you consider staying? Not just as their doctor, but—" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I know it's forward, and we barely know each other, but I've seen how you are with them, how they respond to you. And I—" He trailed off, looking suddenly uncertain. "Are you proposing some sort of arrangement?" Penelope asked, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. "A governess position?" Blake shook his head. "No, I'm proposing marriage." Penelope stared at him, stunned. "Blake, you can't be serious." "I am." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "It wouldn't have to be. I mean, we could keep separate rooms if you prefer. But the girls need a mother, and well, you seem to care for them already." "And what about you?" Penelope asked softly. "What do you need, Blake?" He looked away, his jaw tight. "I need to know those girls are cared for proper, that they have a chance at a good life." "That's not an answer." Blake sighed, turning back to her. "Truth is, I've grown to respect you this past week, Penelope. You're kind, smart, capable. Any man would be lucky to have you as a wife, and any children would be blessed to have you as a mother, blood relation or not." Penelope felt tears pricking at her eyes. How long had it been since anyone had spoken to her with such genuine respect? "You know I can't have children of my own," she reminded him. "Those two sleeping right there need a mother," Blake said simply. "If God sees fit to bless us with more, so be it. If not, I'd still count myself fortunate." Penelope looked at the sleeping girls, their faces peaceful, despite the storm still raging outside. She thought of her empty clinic in Williamsburg, of the whispers that followed her through town, of the lonely evenings spent with only her books for company. "I need time to think," she finally said. "This isn't a decision to make lightly." Blake nodded, his expression understanding. Take all the time you need. The offer stands. The storm continued through the night, and Penelope lay awake in her bed, listening to the rain against the window panes and turning Blake's proposal over in her mind. Marriage. To a man she'd known for only a week. It was madness. And yet, there was something solid about Blake Jenkins, something trustworthy that she hadn't found in her first husband. He was honest about his motivations. He wanted a mother for his nieces, not romance. Perhaps that was for the best. Her heart had been battered enough. She wasn't sure it could withstand another romantic disappointment. But the girls, sweet Elizabeth with her infectious giggles and Mary with her serious questions and protective nature. They had already worked their way into Penelope's heart. The thought of leaving them in a week's time was increasingly painful. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed world and a rainbow arcing across the eastern sky. The girls were delighted by the colorful phenomenon, pointing excitedly from the porch as they ate the breakfast Penelope had prepared. Uncle Blake says rainbows are God's promise, Mary informed Penelope solemnly. Do you think that's true? I do, Penelope replied, watching as Blake emerged from the barn, leading his horse. Their eyes met across the yard, and he tipped his hat to her, his expression questioning. Penelope turned back to the girls. Finish your breakfast, and then we'll start our lessons. The day passed with an undercurrent of tension that the children seemed oblivious to. Blake went about his ranch work, checking on them occasionally, but giving Penelope the space she'd requested. She, in turn, focused on the girls, teaching them their letters and helping them make a simple stew for dinner. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Penelope found Blake on the porch, smoking a cigarette and staring out at the star-filled sky. I've made my decision, she said quietly, sitting beside him on the porch step. Blake extinguished his cigarette, turning to face her. And? I'll stay, Penelope said. I'll marry you and be a mother to the girls. Relief washed over Blake's features. You're sure? I don't want you to feel pressured. I'm sure, Penelope replied, but I have conditions. Name them. First, we'll have a real marriage, not just an arrangement. I won't be treated as a governess or a hired hand. Blake nodded slowly. All right. What else? I want to continue practicing medicine, at least for the people on the ranch and the nearest neighbors. I trained hard for my skills, and I won't let them go to waste. That's fair, Blake agreed. Nearest doctor's a half-day's ride anyway. Having you here would be a blessing for more than just us. And finally, Penelope said, meeting his gaze steadily, I want us to be honest with each other, always. No secrets, no lies, no hidden resentments. Blake extended his hand to her. I can promise that, Penelope. I've always believed in speaking plain. She took his hand, surprised by the warmth that spread through her at his touch. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Jenkins. Blake, he corrected, a small smile playing at his lips. If we're to be married, you should use my given name. Blake, she repeated, returning his smile. He kept hold of her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. When would you like to be married? We'd need to go to town for a proper ceremony. Soon, Penelope said. The girls need stability. Perhaps next week? That would give me time to send word to Dr. Wilson that I won't be returning to my practice in Williamsburg. Blake nodded. I'll ride to town tomorrow, make the arrangements. The circuit preacher should be coming through in about 10 days. They sat in companionable silence for a while, still holding hands, the night air cool around them. Finally, Blake spoke again, his voice softer than before. You know, when I found out about Sarah and the girls, I was terrified. Thought I'd ruin those children sure as anything. He shook his head, his expression wry. Still might, I suppose, but with you here? Well, I think they'll have a real chance at happiness. We'll figure it out together, Penelope assured him, surprising herself with how much she meant it. The next morning, Blake rode to town while Penelope broke the news to the girls. They were sitting at the kitchen table finishing their breakfast when she decided to tell them. Girls, I have something important to tell you, she began. setting down her coffee cup. "Are you leaving?" Elizabeth asked immediately, her lower lip beginning to tremble. "Please don't go, Miss Penny." "No, sweetheart, quite the opposite," Penelope said, reaching out to smooth Elizabeth's hair. "Your Uncle Blake has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. I'm going to stay here and be a part of your family." Mary's eyes widened. "You're going to be our aunt." "Yes, but you can still call me Penny if you prefer," Penelope said, watching their reactions carefully. Elizabeth slid off her chair and came around the table to throw her arms around Penelope's waist. "Does that mean you'll be like our mama now?" Penelope swallowed the lump in her throat. "If you'd like that, yes. I can never replace your real mother, but I would be honored to care for you as if you were my own daughters." Mary remained in her seat, her expression thoughtful. "Did Uncle Blake ask you to marry him because of us? Because we need a mother?" Penelope hesitated, then remembered her condition of honesty. "That was part of it, yes. Your uncle loves you very much and wants what's best for you, but he also said he respects me and thinks we could have a good life together." "Do you love him?" Mary pressed, her young face serious. "I respect him very much," Penelope answered carefully, "and I care for him. Love can grow with time." Mary seemed to consider this, then nodded decisively. "Mama said that's how it was with her and Pa. She said she liked him first, then loved him after." "Your mama was a wise woman," Penelope said softly. Elizabeth tugged at Penelope's skirt. "Will you teach me to sew like you? And can I help with the babies when you and Uncle Blake have them?" Penelope's smile faltered slightly. "I would love to teach you to sew, Elizabeth, but you should know that the doctors have told me I may not be able to have babies of my own." "That's all right," Mary said, coming around to join her sister. "You'll have us." Tears pricked at Penelope's eyes as both girls hugged her. "Yes," she whispered, "I'll have you." The next 10 days passed in a flurry of preparations. Blake returned from town with news that the circuit preacher would indeed be arriving on Saturday, and that he had purchased material for a new dress for Penelope and new clothes for the girls. He had also brought back a simple gold band that he presented to Penelope with uncharacteristic shyness. "It's not fancy," he apologized, "but the store in town didn't have much selection." "It's perfect," Penelope assured him, allowing him to slip it onto her finger to check the size. It fit well, and the sight of it gleaming on her hand sent a strange flutter through her stomach. The girls were excited about the upcoming wedding, helping Penelope sew her dress and picking wildflowers to decorate the house. Hank rode to the nearest farms to invite the few neighbors to the ceremony, and Blake cleared out the barn for the celebration afterward. The night before the wedding, after the girls were asleep, Penelope found Blake in the sitting room, staring into the fire. "Second thoughts?" she asked lightly, though her heart beat a little faster at the possibility. Blake looked up, his expression serious but calm. "No. You." Penelope shook her head, sitting in the chair opposite him. "No. I think we're doing the right thing for the girls." "And for us?" Blake asked, his blue eyes searching hers. Penelope considered this. Over the past 2 weeks, she had come to appreciate Blake's quiet strength, his dedication to his nieces, his unfailing courtesy toward her. There was an attraction there, too. She had to admit a warmth that spread through her when he smiled, a flutter in her stomach when their hands accidentally touched. "Yes," she said softly, "for us too." The wedding day dawned clear and mild. Hank had arranged for a neighbor woman to help the girls dress while Blake waited nervously downstairs. Penelope, alone in her room, put on the dress they had made, a simple but elegant blue gown that complemented her eyes. There was a knock at her door, and Mary peeked in, resplendent in her new yellow dress. "Miss Penny, are you ready? The preacher's here, and Uncle Blake looks like he might be sick." Penelope laughed, adjusting her hair one last time. "I'm ready. Don't worry about your uncle. Men often get nervous at weddings." Downstairs, the sitting room had been transformed. Wildflowers adorned every surface, and the neighbors, about a dozen in all, stood in their Sunday best, watching as Penelope descended the stairs. Blake waited by the fireplace, cleaned up in a way Penelope had never seen him, freshly shaven, hair neatly combed, wearing a crisp white shirt and dark trousers. His eyes widened slightly as he saw her, and a smile spread across his face that made Penelope's heart skip. She took her place beside him, accepting Elizabeth's hand when the little girl slipped it into hers. The ceremony was simple and brief. They exchanged vows, promising to honor and cherish each other. When Blake slid the gold band onto her finger, his hand trembled slightly, and Penelope found herself squeezing his fingers reassuringly. "By the power vested in me," the preacher concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Blake hesitated, then leaned in to place a gentle, chaste kiss on Penelope's lips. It was brief, but Penelope felt a warmth spread through her at the contact. The celebration afterward was lively, with food contributed by the neighbors and music provided by a neighbor who played the fiddle. The girls danced with abandon, their faces flushed with excitement. Penelope found herself genuinely enjoying the company of their nearest neighbors, who welcomed her warmly and expressed relief at having a doctor living closer than the town. As the sun began to set, the guests departed, and Hank tactfully took the girls to the barn to see a new litter of kittens, giving the newlyweds some privacy. "Well, Mrs. Jenkins," Blake said, standing awkwardly in the kitchen after the last guest had gone, "I suppose that's that." "I suppose it is," Penelope agreed, equally uncertain. They stood in silence for a moment, the reality of their situation settling over them. They were married husband and wife in the eyes of God and the law. And tonight would be their wedding night. "Blake," Penelope began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. He seemed to understand her hesitation. "I meant what I said before. We can take things slow. Keep separate rooms for now if you prefer." Penelope considered this. They had agreed to a real marriage, not just an arrangement, and despite the unusual circumstances of their courtship, she did feel a genuine attraction to Blake. "I think I would like to try being a proper wife," she said carefully, "if you would like that." The look in Blake's eyes made her breath catch. "I would like that very much, Penelope." When Hank brought the girls back to the house, they were full of stories about the kittens and begging to be allowed to bring one into the house. Blake promised they could choose one kitten once they were old enough to leave their mother, and the girls went to bed satisfied with this compromise. After tucking the children in, Penelope retreated to what was now their bedroom, changing into the nightgown she had carefully sewn over the past week. It was simple but pretty, with small embroidered flowers at the neck and cuffs. When Blake entered the room, he paused in the doorway, his eyes taking in the sight of her sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You are beautiful, Penelope," he said softly, closing the door behind him. She blushed, unaccustomed to compliments. "Thank you." Blake crossed to her, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. "I want you to know something. I may not have courted you proper, and this marriage may have started for the girl's sake, but I do care for you, deeply, and I count myself fortunate to have you as my wife." Penelope felt tears spring to her eyes at his sincerity. "And I care for you, Blake. More than I expected to." He reached up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle. "May I kiss you? Properly this time, not like that peck in front of the preacher." Penelope nodded, and Blake leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that started soft but quickly deepened. Penelope felt herself responding, her hands moving to his shoulders, then sliding up to tangle in his hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Blake's eyes were dark with desire, but he visibly restrained himself. "We can stop any time you want," he assured her. "Just say the word." "I don't want to stop," Penelope whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. "I want to be your wife, Blake, in every way." That night, Penelope discovered a passion in herself that her first husband had never awakened. Blake was gentle and considerate, taking his time to ensure her pleasure. Afterward, lying in his arms, she felt a contentment she had never expected to find again. "Penny," Blake murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. I think I might be falling in love with you. Penelope raised her head to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. I think I might be falling in love with you too, she admitted softly. He pulled her closer, dropping a kiss on her forehead. Then we did things backwards, didn't we? Most folks fall in love, then get married. We've never been most folks, Penelope replied with a small laugh, and I wouldn't change how things happened. It brought me to you and the girls. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment for all of them as they settled into life as a family. There were challenges. Of course, Elizabeth had nightmares about her parents. Mary occasionally tested boundaries with stubborn defiance, and Blake and Penelope had to learn to communicate as husband and wife rather than as temporary allies. But there were joys too. The first time Elizabeth called Penelope Mama Penny instead of Miss Penny brought tears to her eyes. The evening Blake taught both girls to play checkers, his patience never wavering despite their constant questions and attempts to change the rules. The day Mary helped Penelope deliver a neighbor's baby and declared that she too wanted to be a doctor someday. 2 months after the wedding, Penelope woke one morning feeling queasy. She dismissed it as a passing illness, but when the feeling persisted for several days, a suspicion began to form. As a doctor, she recognized the signs, but as a woman who had been told she was barren, she hesitated to hope. After a week, she could no longer deny the possibility. She waited until the girls were occupied with their lessons before approaching Blake in the barn, where he was repairing a bridle. Blake, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I need to tell you something. He looked up immediately, concern crossing his features. What is it? Are you unwell? Penelope took a deep breath. I believe I might be with child. Blake's hands stilled, the bridle forgotten. Truly. Penelope nodded, tears filling her eyes. It's early, and after what happened, I don't want to hope too much, but yes, I think so. Blake crossed to her in 2 strides, gathering her into his arms. A baby, he whispered against her hair. Our baby. You're happy? Penelope asked, pulling back to see his face. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Blake said, his eyes bright with emotion. But Penny, are you all right? After what those doctors told you? I don't know, she admitted. I never thought this would happen. I'm afraid to believe it's real, afraid something will go wrong. Blake placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. But Penny, I believe this baby is meant to be, just like you were meant to find us. The months that followed were filled with cautious joy. The girls were ecstatic about the prospect of a new sibling, with Mary appointing herself Penelope's special helper and Elizabeth constantly talking to the growing bump. Penelope's pregnancy progressed without complications, much to her relief and amazement. Blake was attentive and protective, insisting she rest and hiring a girl from town to help with the household chores. Penelope continued to provide medical care to their neighbors, but allowed Blake to accompany her on any calls that took her far from the ranch. As her due date approached, Penelope arranged for a midwife from the nearest town to stay at the ranch. Despite being a doctor, she knew she would need help when the time came. Blake worried constantly, checking on her throughout the day and holding her close at night, his hand always finding its way to the swell of her belly where their child grew. Do you think it's a boy or a girl? He asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while the girls played in the yard. I don't know, Penelope replied honestly. I'll be happy either way. Me too, Blake agreed, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Though the girls are hoping for a sister. Penelope laughed. I heard Elizabeth telling the baby last night that if it was a boy, they would still let it play with dolls sometimes. Blake's expression softened as he watched his nieces. They're good girls. They've come so far from those frightened little things we brought home. They have, Penelope agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. We've all come far. The baby came on a clear spring morning, with the sun streaming through the bedroom window and the scent of wildflowers drifting on the breeze. The labor was long but straightforward, with the midwife guiding Penelope through each contraction and Blake refusing to leave her side, despite the midwife's protests that men had no place in a birthing room. "I'm staying with my wife," he had said firmly, gripping Penelope's hand. "Nothing you can say will move me from this spot." When their son was finally born, his lusty cries filling the room, Penelope wept with joy and relief. Blake, his own eyes wet with tears, cradled the tiny red-faced infant as if he were made of the most delicate glass. "He's perfect," Blake whispered, placing their son in Penelope's arms. "Look what we made, Penny." "What shall we name him?" Penelope asked, marveling at the tiny fingers that wrapped around her own. "I was thinking Thomas after your father," Blake suggested. "If you like it." Penelope smiled through her tears. "Thomas Jenkins. It's perfect." The girls were allowed in shortly after, their eyes wide with wonder at their new brother. Mary approached cautiously, peering at the baby with intense curiosity. "He's so small," she whispered. "Would you like to hold him?" Penelope offered. With Blake's help, Mary carefully took the baby in her arms, her expression transforming from nervousness to awe. "Hello, Thomas," she said softly. "I'm your big sister." Elizabeth, not to be outdone, climbed onto the bed next to Penelope. "Can I touch him?" "Gently," Penelope cautioned, guiding Elizabeth's small finger to stroke the baby's cheek. Elizabeth beamed. "He's soft. And look, Mama Penny, he has Uncle Blake's nose." "That he does," Penelope agreed, meeting Blake's eyes over the children's heads. The love she saw there took her breath away. That evening, with the children finally asleep, the girls in their room and Thomas in a cradle beside the bed, Blake sat on the edge of the mattress, watching Penelope as she rested. "You should sleep," he said softly. "You've had a long day." "I will," she promised. "I just want to look at him a bit longer." She gazed at their sleeping son, still hardly able to believe he was real. Blake took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For everything. For coming with us that day. For agreeing to marry me. For loving the girls as your own. For giving me a son." His voice broke slightly. "For making me the happiest man in Texas." Penelope smiled, squeezing his hand. "Do you remember what they used to say about me in Williamsburg?" Blake's jaw tightened. "That you were barren. Worthless." "And what did you call me, that first day in my clinic?" "The doctor," Blake recalled. "The only person who could help my nieces." Penelope nodded, tears filling her eyes. "You saw value in me when no one else did. You gave me a family when I thought I would always be alone." She looked at their son, then back to her husband. "I love you, Blake Jenkins. With all my heart." Blake leaned down to kiss her softly. "And I love you, Penelope Jenkins, till my dying day and beyond." As Penelope drifted off to sleep that night, her husband beside her and their newborn son sleeping peacefully in his cradle, she thought about the strange, winding path that had led her here. From the whispers and scorn of Williamsburg to the love and respect she had found on a small ranch with a family that was now completely, wonderfully hers. They had called her barren and worthless, but Blake had seen what she truly was: a healer, a nurturer, the mother his orphaned nieces needed. And in finding her place with them, Penelope had discovered that she was never barren at all. Her heart had always been fertile ground, ready to bloom with love when given the chance. 5 years later, Penelope stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Blake taught 5-year-old Thomas how to throw a lasso, while 10-year-old Elizabeth and 13-year-old Mary took turns riding their favorite horses in the corral. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, where their second child grew another miracle that still filled her with wonder. The Jenkins Ranch had prospered, growing from a modest spread to one of the most successful in the county. With Penelope's careful management and Blake's hard work, They had added more land, more cattle, and built a proper medical office where Penelope now treated patients 3 days a week. Mary had become her unofficial apprentice, showing a natural talent for medicine that filled Penelope with pride. Elizabeth, more interested in animals than people, had become Blake's shadow, learning everything she could about ranching and declaring her intention to run the place someday. And Thomas, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's gentle spirit, was the bridge between their two worlds, equally at home, helping Penelope mix medicines or following Blake around the ranch. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the land they had built together, Blake looked up and saw Penelope watching. He handed the small lasso to Thomas and jogged over to join her on the porch. "How are you feeling?" he asked, placing a protective hand on her belly. "Wonderful," Penelope replied honestly, leaning into his embrace. "Happy?" Blake dropped a kiss on her forehead. "You know, I thank God every day that I walked into your clinic that afternoon." "So do I," Penelope said, watching as the children laughed and played in the fading light. "So do I." They stood together as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, their family whole and thriving around them, living proof that even in the wild, unforgiving West, love could take root and flourish in the most unlikely of places.